Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Regeneration Podcast. We're back again, people. And Mike, how you been?
Good. Can I mention something medical?
As long as it's not intended for me.
No. 2 days ago, I had double hernia surgery. So right now I'm intense pain in my solar plexus area. They say it's a form of surgery that 30% of men go through. And I guess God bless laparoscopy, right? Because I think though there's a certain amount of pain, I have a feeling it was much more painful even 10 years ago.
Yeah. My goodness. Yeah.
Yeah. But if you see me wincing in pain every so often, that's the reason. Yeah.
Sorry. So today we're going to talk about something. Mike and I have been trying to talk about distributism with somebody for months. It's one of the first things we wanted to talk about when we started the podcast, and I couldn't find anybody to talk to. And somebody recommended that we talk to today's guest, Laurie Johnson, who's professor of political science and director of the primary text certificate, which you'll have to tell me what that is, at Kansas State University. And she's got a really wonderful podcast. What's the name of your podcast? I got it right here.
Philosophy.
Yep.
Yeah, political philosophy, Dr. Laurie
It's
Johnson.
excellent. It's really excellent.
It is excellent.
You're
That's
so
a great
clear.
title.
And so I lost there. I'm sorry. So yeah, I recommend anybody check that out. I've watched quite a few of the videos, and it's very informative. So our friend, actually, our last guest, Nathaniel Heil, recommended Laurie to me, and it was the hardest thing to get a hold of her through the college website, because I think it was your school has like a form if you want to write to a professor rather than a direct email address. I think it was.
Oh my God.
And I couldn't figure out how to do it. So eventually what I did is I got the email for the department secretary or the department, and they hooked me up with Laurie, which was great.
I think it's just that Laurie is a big deal, and we have to go through her agents and things
That's
like
right.
that.
All right,
That's
I've
right.
got gatekeepers.
Yeah.
Mhm. Me too. It's a dog. It's
That's so funny because my son does web scraping for a company I won't name, but like he's specifically about getting information from educational sites, for mailing purposes and things like that. And he got to K-State and literally was stymied, and it took him days. And so obviously we need to do something about that.
Isn't that funny?
So to start now, I mean, my own interest in distributism and communitarianism, which is very organic. In fact, I was doing it, or at least trying to do it, long before I knew there was a term, or distributists. And that was actually relatively late in the game for me. I don't think I really heard about it till 12 years ago or something like this. Nevertheless, I've been an organic farmer for, I don't know, 30 years, 20 years.
Michael, you're telling me you didn't hear about distributism until about 10 years ago?
Right. I don't think I
Wow.
really got into it. Not until because my interest, my academic interest, it was never in political philosophy.
Gotcha.
It was in literature. My doctorate's in literature, so I would pay attention to that stuff, and I was really interested in biodynamic farming and gardening at the same time. And I was, from the beginning, and this is a good 30 years ago, even more. I was really interested in the CSA movement, the community supported agriculture, which is what we do at our farm. But at that time, I think in the country, there were only a handful of CSAs, and only one in Michigan, where I live. And so this idea of this kind of localist idea was really appealing to me. It just made perfect sense. And before we get into the interview proper, there's a quote I would like to read from Hilaire Belloc's The Servile State, which really struck me when I reread it again yesterday. The present instinct, use and meaning of property is lost to it, and this has two very powerful effects, each strongly inclining our modern wage earners to ignore the old barrier which lay between a condition of servitude and a condition of freedom. The first effect is this, that property is no longer what they seek, no longer what they think is obtainable for themselves. The second effect is that they regard the possessors of property as a class apart, whom they must always obey, often envy, and sometimes hate, whose moral right is so singular a position most of them would hesitate to concede, and many of whom now strongly deny, but whose position they, at any rate, accept as a known and permanent social fact, the origins of which they have forgotten, and the foundations of which they believe to be immemorial. And that, I mean, that is really, for me, the crux of the matter. As a person who grew up in the city, owning land. In fact, even 30 years ago, when my friend and I were investigating CSA, so we wanted to start a farm, that was the obstacle. How do you get land? And it took me, I had to flip a few houses before we had enough capital to buy, and we only have 10 acres now, but we had to keep flipping houses until we got to a place where we could actually be sustainable. At least.
I didn't know that was your story with Bonnie, Michael, flipping houses to get to where you are now.
Well, it wasn't intentional. Well, it kind of was intentional. So we bought our first house, and it was on a double lot. So we had a big garden. It was a beautiful garden too. And then we sold that. Well, it wasn't just flipping houses. We were outgrowing houses because
fair enough.
Our first house had 2.5 bedrooms, and we have 9 children. So we kept growing out of the house. So we had to move to that house to another house. And that house, the second house, we had 2 acres and we actually had our first CSA just growing on a half an acre. And I think we had 10 people. And then, we saw we needed to get more land to do what we really wanted to do, because we really wanted to raise animals. And so we bought this place on 10 acres, which was much, it's like the perfect environment for this. It reminds me of the old M.G. Cain's book, 5 Acres in Independence, which is from the 1940s, kind of part of the Back to the Land movement. So it's part of my story of how I got here. And then I found out about distributism, like I said, probably, I bet, when I really got interested in it was through my late friend Stratford Caldecott. When he had a chapter on it in one of his books. So Laurie, welcome to the show. And I wonder if you could just give a kind of thumbnail sketch of what we mean by this word distributism for people who might not be familiar with it.
Sure. First of all, I want to say I'm not necessarily an adherent of distributism. I wanted to learn about it, and so I taught a seminar on it for the group that I mentioned earlier, the Morin Academy, to learn more about it. And I got into it through the Catholic worker movement, which I also am not totally necessarily an adherent of, but I was interested in it, right? So the way that I learn about things is to teach them. So I'm sure later on we can get into why perhaps not to totally invest yourself in any one particular, philosophy, whether it's economics or whatever it is. But to answer your question, it kind of emerged, I think I would say, in the late 19th century, especially with through the Catholic Church and the teachings in Rerum Novarum, with Pope Leo XIII, who was dealing with the fact that, as I read that encyclical, he seemed to be dealing with the fact that socialist thought was on the rise, socialist movements were on the rise. The working class really had a problem that it needed a solution to, and they were being attracted to the socialist movements. And of course, he viewed them as materialistic and sort of godless, and therefore wanted to address this, the obvious problems of just exploitation and, lack of autonomy that the workers had, but in a authentically Christian way. So a lot of Rerum Novarum was about, actually fairly liberal in its approach to property, but very, very much wanting to address workers' rights, and especially the right to unionize, but with a Christian overlay. So, he called for Christian unionization, basically, or Catholic Catholic organizations that could fight for workers' rights, higher pay, more involvement, and so on and so forth. And there's just a little bit, actually, if you read it, there's just a little bit about actual distribution of property.
Right.
And that has to do with land. So he had noticed, what also Marxists notice in their own way, which is that, the beginning of capitalism starts with, first the throwing off of people from the land and the turning land into sort of like a market for tenant farming and profit making, and in that process, earlier process of enclosure, right, which starts in the 16th, 17th, going into the 18th century, throwing the peasants off the land. That's what created this huge pool of labor that then got exploited. So he sensed that, in order to reverse that, we need to somehow return more people to the land and to self-sufficiency. So anyway, his encyclical, which I think was probably hugely controversial in his own time, which now seems rather like conservative and even not terribly surprising, kind of got that ball rolling. And then you mentioned Hilaire Belloc. I mean, there are other like contributions along the way from the church. Belloc and Chesterton. Chesterton was a huge advocate of distributism and really got more into like the land redistribution, hated urbanization. So the thought behind it, I mean, in a nutshell, is people can't really have any degree of independence without self-sufficiency. And you can't have self-sufficiency as an individual either. You do it through community, which capitalism kind of blows up, right? Disintegrates community. So it usually, like, I know Chesterton called for the breaking up of monopolies, government intervention to redistribute land, get more people out of the cities back to the land where they could feed themselves and not be so dependent upon this faceless system and market imperatives.
Yeah, and I think interesting, not only was that a Catholic phenomenon at the time, historical phenomenon, but the Irish poet A.E. or George William Russell was also interested in the same ideas. For Ireland, he saw that increasing urbanization and industrialization as evils, and so part of for me is in my work as a literary scholar, I specializing in early modern literature. I mean, you read Utopia by Thomas More, and enclosure is a main feature of his complaint about the political structure right there. And that was only at the beginning of enclosure, and it kind of was a long, drawn out, as E.P. Thompson, the Marxist historian, says, it was long and drawn out and all done legally and by laws made by the people who benefited from the laws, which tells us that things really haven't changed too much in the last few hundred years.
Yeah, right.
So my question, to further examine this, is where is this movement now?
Not very far. So, and I mean, this is something that, Spencer Hess and I do this podcast together called Dust Bowl Diatribes. And on it, we have kind of tried to inject a certain amount of economic realism into this whole discussion, because without insights from Marx, and again, like, we're not, it's interesting, because people want to put you in categories. We're also not Marxists, but there are certain aspects of Marxist analysis of capitalist economics that are crucial to understanding where we are today, what's happened. And without that, distributism turns into just kind of a wish, a nostalgic kind of looking back, wanting to kind of fantasize about turning back the clock to, I like to say, the pioneer days, obviously. Like many people fantasize about living under some sort of feudal system as though that was great. But of course, it doesn't go anywhere. So we do have a lot of people kind of talking about distributism. I'm familiar with and somewhat friendly with the Front Porch Republic folks, for instance.
I write for them very often. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate their perspective. And I consider it encouraging that they want to think about and talk about it. But I do think sometimes they get a little stuck in that kind of just because there's just a really powerful urge to regress, right? And not deal with the fact that we have such a different economy, right? And it's so overwhelming, the political and economic forces against this kind of thing. We could do this as individuals sort of halfway, right? You can't survive on it though. You have to admit, like if you do organic farming and CSAs, you can do that as a sideline to something else you're doing, but you can't in the current system easily survive on that.
No.
Well, let me ask a question about that, because Michael, this would be, you're close to it. This summer, my wife runs the domestic hall for our local county fair, and we live in an agricultural community. And I was sitting at the pie tasting contest, talk about regressive or nostalgic, but I was talking to a guy who lives among the Amish in upstate New York, and his point was that because the Amish can fund each other and they can get access to capital, that these small farms are in fact for them pretty productive. And he said, like, his problem is he can't get access to capital. And I wonder, and I'm not trying to like draw things like at too high of a height here, whether when we bring up like Bill Gates buying up all the farmland and so forth. But this guy, he was making a case to me that like, if you could get access to capital and buy, say, 20 acres of decent farmland, he thinks you can make a lot of money. But is that disagreeing with what you guys are saying? Is he wrong?
No,
I don't think he's wrong. No, but but they're Amish and they have like a common belief system and a tradition in which they can cooperate and even lend to each other or, help each other out in a huge way. And they have an identity that people recognize. And so there's a certain amount of support for them simply because people do kind of like to tap back into that older traditional way of life through their purchasing and so forth. But for the most part, we don't have that, like people who go into this tend to want to try to get people to support them, right, somehow. And for the most part, you find that most people in this world don't get it and don't want to do that kind of work and don't want to lend you money. They want you to use the bank because there's not that level of trust. So I think that the Amish, the Bruderhof, these people have a particular advantage because they have a very strong identity that's shared.
And that's what I see. Well, I don't know about you, Laurie, but where I live in Michigan, there has over the last, 20 some years, been a great influx of Amish into certain areas. In fact, a new community just started out maybe 15 minutes away from my house. And so as much as I can, I do business with the Amish, like for, poultry processing or animal processing or buying feed, hired Amish carpenters to put my roof on my house. And because one of the things, because that's one of the places you see it work in these small scale humanitarian also kinds of communities. But I do see, and in fact, this is what I thought, with the onset of the pandemic, when it really looked, and I'm still think it might be possible that our current monetary system might cave. That I wrote about this in my book Transfiguration, and thinking, the part of the problem is that to do anything resembling this kind of, small is beautiful enterprise and to achieve any kind of human flourishing, one of the big problems is you're still stuck in the money system of the man, right? And which was interesting. So at the beginning of the pandemic, people were starting to actually seriously talk about local currencies. And Mike and I were friends with an economist, Guido Preparata. I don't know if you know him, who I encountered his work when I was working on that book, because he was about one of the only scholars out there talking about perishable currency. So
this is a guy, Laurie, too, who we've probably had him on 3 times. That's when you mentioned Front Porch, having a long interview with him in a video recording. I try to inject the antidote you and I both agree on using preparata. So he taught at the Gregorian. I think he's one of the world's foremost experts on this guy, Silvio Gesell, who wrote a book called, The New Economic Order, which would say that, again, perishable currency, the fact that money does not correspond to the things outside of it is maybe at the center of history when we look at Dante, Muhammad, and all these people. But that, it had been tried in 2 communities in the interwar period between World War I and World War II in Germany and Austria, that when money circulates like blood, that
water.
Yeah, right. That, everything rises. And Preparata himself, so he taught at the Gregorian, 2 things, perishable currency. And the other one, which I agree with you, is that, and Michael and I taking some of our instincts from Rudolf Steiner, is that this kind of nostalgic, maybe too easy reaction against the totality of the industrial mode of production. That Karl Polanyi, who's something of a hero of mine too, he gives us the notion that, the marketplace was good. If it was during these hours from 12 to 3 on a Saturday, these market forces were very powerful. But once they got disembedded, like a genie leaving the bottle, we all became the market's, puppets. Similarly, if we can keep machines and assembly lines kind of embedded in something small and that they don't transform the whole world like they have with hospitals and schools, that everything gets transformed in their image, that the industrial mode of production where everybody has to get their hands dirty once in a while can be very useful. And I do think that's a shortcoming with some distributists and some like overly nostalgic kind of localists and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they don't recognize that the larger context, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, 2 things spring to mind. One is, at the root, as a political scientist, I tend to think that at the root of everything good and bad is kind of like the power motive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but along with that is also, the state of traditions and culture. And of course the 2 are intertwined, but so kind of what I was alluding to before, the cultural practices and traditions that would have made for something like sequestering the market into a Saturday or, putting it in its proper place, they've been blown up by, basically by liberalism, by capitalism. At this point, they're kind of oh wait.
There we go. Sorry about that.
They've been degraded, and then we have, such powerful forces wielding political power across the world at the corporate level, right? That, I mean, there's no way to fully address, no matter what you do, there's no way to fully address that problem, I think, by returning to or trying to even build cultural institutions again. I'm not sure how you do that. I mean, I don't have an answer to this, but I'm not sure how you do that. I mean, one of the reasons I'm interested in the Catholic Church is because it's a very large, I'm more than interested, I'm a Catholic, but like as a social scientist, it's a very large and still fairly influential institution that's global. And that's hard to come by. The United Nations doesn't quite cut it as far as like a culture changing vehicle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's also why I'm interested in Marxism, because I think that the power of these corporations would have to be broken up for anything new to really happen, unless, of course, we reach a point of just total breakdown, right? In which something else can come in and fill the void.
Yeah, that's what I was anticipating. But I think the bad guys were also anticipating that, so they're trying to move to a new system.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, the point about money, I mean, we're seeing, I don't know much about like cryptocurrency, but we're seeing like some creativity and some, playing around with different currency systems. And I'm aware of like experiments from the past about local currencies. I think both are, sort of like ultimately doomed because of the larger global financial system. It's too powerful, right?
Mhm.
So we have tried local currencies and they last for a while, but then just not enough people or things change. The little core that produced them goes away, the conditions go away. And so they crumble. And even cryptocurrencies, I think, I don't know exactly where they're going, but it looks to me like a lot of folks are finding them to be, really kind of ephemeral.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned earlier, I mean, your interest in your your continuation in the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And Mike and I are both Catholics, by the way. And in one of your podcasts recently, I was very struck by a statement you had. You said you've been a lifelong Catholic. I've been a lifelong Catholic, and I didn't hear about distributism until 10 years ago in a book, right? Never heard about it. And I went to Catholic schools, taught at a Catholic school, I went to, talk about a failure. But reading the history of distributism, goes back to the beginning with all talk and no action.
I think it became,
On behalf
for me,
of the hierarchy. I mean, the
Yeah.
Reverend of Arms is a fabulous document. That's totally ignored by the Catholic hierarchy.
it just kind of got caught to me in like jargon so quickly that like I've worked for the church for 25 years. And even when I was in grad school, it's just, the jargon was conservative on social issues, progressive on economic issues. The jargon was the greatest secret in the church is the social justice teachings of the church. And the jargon was, again, like Rerum Novarum, like it's all there. And distributism, like it was just a word that we have a way, as Catholics, we have a way that's not socialist and not capitalist, but it just never, ever, ever got beyond that. And it doesn't mean that I think we all agree that there's not some great working insights that could be practical. But boy, with I just think it got lifted up into the realm of jargon so quickly that it almost never landed for anybody,
Yeah. I mean, I'm a Catholic convert, probably been about 20 years. I literally have never heard of this in a church, period, full stop. Never. And in fact, it took me for a while, I became kind of alienated, primarily instigated by the pedophile scandal.
Yeah.
I couldn't wrap
not
my
a
head
bad reason. Yeah.
Oh, And so in the wake of that, in order to kind of like see if I still wanted to be a Catholic, I and Spencer and a few other people started to read some of these encyclicals and get a better grip on what was Catholic teaching and on the things that we cared about, like the environment, like economics. And we discovered this. And then I realized, yes, it's completely ignored. And in fact, I mean, there's multiple reasons for this, I'm sure, but among them is just, in my experience, Catholic priests really underestimate the intelligence and curiosity of people. So they don't think that you want to know about it. Furthermore, they tend to be kind of cowed by, or they are conservatives, or they're cowed by the conservatives in their church, much like Protestant ministers. And they're afraid to say anything that might offend them. And so, you get a lot of pablum, but you don't get anything much. You don't get much substance at all, let alone a discussion of Catholic social teaching. And then coupled with the fact that they tend to be, when they do reading groups or teaching outside of the Mass, it tends to be very top down. So the people who run that church decide what you're going to learn. And then in my experience, again, I mean, it could be different elsewhere, but there's not a lot of openness to, oh, what do you have to say? What do you bring to the table, right? So there's no injection point. For instance, I mean, I've become an admirer of Dorothy Day, right? Like, and I've gotten the sense that there's just zero interest in my interest in Dorothy Day with actual Catholic churches. So there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect there between Catholic churches and the Catholic worker movement, which you would normally think they would be sort of like mutually reinforcing. But no. So this is a great frustration of mine, for sure.
Mine too. Well, I was just interviewed recently. Pardon me. I had a young Catholic convert who was concerned, who wanted to know about my relationship to Dorothy Day. like I love her.
Mhm.
And that was suspicious. I mean, it still reminds me
Isn't
of
that so funny? I could say unambiguously you love her.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I said, well, what's not to love? She lived the gospel in a radical way and was a daily communicant. That's about as conservative a Catholic as you can get, right? And
Yeah.
it's interesting because you mentioned this, and there seems to be a disconnect to me between, I guess, the mainstream Catholic Church, which is really surreal to me. I mean, I don't understand it anymore, and I understand it even less over the last 2 years. But so many of the people who profess to be distributists these days, and I know this because on social media, I would try to see what kinds of distributists were out there, so I could learn something more about it and see who's doing anything. And very few people are doing anything, but those who are tend to think you can't be a distributist, or you can't even be interested unless you're going to be devoted to the traditional Latin mass, and you speak mostly in Latin during the day. What the heck? And I think maybe the problem is and maybe, I don't know if this is by design, by the kind of lip service. The Catholic hierarchy will pay it to distributism once in a while, once every 100 years or so, and that they're really as much slaves to the corporate forces as any government. But that there's this disconnect that these people who would really like to have a vital Catholic life, and who are generally, I would say, pretty conservative, are really interested in distributism. It's a strange disconnect for me. And on the other hand, so many of those people, as we mentioned earlier before we started recording, there's not just nostalgia, but as Mike and I call it, is there kind of a cosplay, or as you put it, they're LARPing. It's just a performance art where you get the requisite tweed, read The Hobbit once a year, and smoke a pipe, and still shop at Walmart.
Which totally excludes me as a female. Like I can't wear, a tweed jacket and smoke.
I
a
know.
pipe.
It's all these dudes, right?
You could try to look like Dorothy Sayers or something, Laurie.
I could try. Yeah, it's really, so I don't know if this is of interest, but to me, this is, a prime example. Down the road, we have St. Mary's, Kansas. And in St. Mary's, Kansas, we do have it's kind of dominated by traditionalist Catholics. They've been there a long time. And I think that there probably hasn't been a pope since I've been alive that they approve of. And they may be the type that think that there's another pope out there. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
But
is St. Mary's a college in this case?
It is I think it's a college. I do think it's a college. Yeah. And maybe like it also extends into the lower grades as well. There's a big campus there. There's a church there. And, I've heard about St. Mary's over the years, but it's always like, oh, those people, they're not, so, but one thing I've picked up is that they don't approve of, whether it was Pope John Paul or now, Pope Francis. I'm sure Pope Francis drives them crazy, but they don't approve. And I've met other people here in Manhattan that are very, very critical of the Pope, and they won't open their minds up to listen to anything that they don't agree with. And basically they're Protestants. They're Protestants, and not even thoughtful ones, right? Like they don't know it. They think they're being, the old phrase, more Catholic than the Pope, right?
Yeah.
Literally. And those folks tend to be now the folks that have gotten back into Latin and want to do things in a very conservative way. I've gone to a mass or two in Kansas City that was full on Latin. I've seen this. It was like stepping back into time, like so many altar boys that you can't even imagine it, like, 15 altar boys up there. I'm not sure what it was all choreographed. But, to be a Catholic means to give very good, strong consideration to the teachings of the church and to sort of trust it to a certain extent, maybe not in everything, but at least in its central teachings. And so, you know, I think there's a temptation here, and it comes partly from wanting to assert your ego over anything, including God, anything that's more powerful than yourself. I also think, though, that people, I mean, you can relate that sort of trad Catholic movement also to like the Christian nationalists of the Protestants. You can relate it to like the full on, you know, sort of racist nationalists at all. I'm not equating these,
Mhm.
but there's a national and even global phenomenon of people trying to revert back to, you know, against liberalism, against, you know, sort of globalization, against universalization, and rediscover some sort of strong identity. So to a certain extent, I want to remain open. And this is what in the last book that I published called Ideological Possession and the Rise of the New Right, I try to use the thought of Carl Jung, Charles Taylor, Eugene McCarraher, and other authors to understand what's really drawing people into what we might, you know, criticize as cosplay or LARPing, right? Why is it that they can do that? Or they could even do destructive things like Islamic fundamentalists blowing people up, or the January 6th riot. You know, they can do those things, but what they can't seem to do is actually change their own lives and start something constructive. And I think it's a desperation, like a sort of there's a psychological mass sickness that where people, you know, at a deep foundational level, feel the powerlessness that they have over their lives to truly change, right? Because these larger economic forces and political forces won't allow that. And as a result of that, they're sort of forced into this sort of, you know, performative expression, across the spectrum, left, right, middle, you know, and then the internet greatly facilitates that. So, you know, the perfect storm is, you know, wanting this strong identity and having a place to sort of play it out, sometimes completely anonymously, right? And to start to imagine that you are in a community because you are, you know, a member of this organization online, or you speak to this group online. I would say that, you know, to the extent that people are wearing tweed jackets and smoking a pipe, they're at least a lot less harmless than people who are climbing up, you know, the Capitol building, you know, on January 6th.
So I think you point out something really important there, is that well, it's not a very simple or one size fits all thing. I mean, because I think part of what people feel alienated from the system and from the world. So I think they're attracted towards something real. They want something real. And this is what I've been writing about in sociology for the last 10 years or whatever. And I think that's one of the attractions for the traditional Latin Mass, is that it's beautiful. Right. And we had my mother's funeral a couple weeks ago, and the priest came, and afterwards I'm like, wow, that was basically the liturgical version of a strip mall. That was about as unaesthetic and it was like I always call it it's like an infomercial for Jesus, right? Which is what, you know, so people don't feel alienated by that, by the kind of and I've seen, on the other hand, I've seen Novus Ordo masses that are extraordinarily beautiful, and I was an altar boy in the Novus Ordo as a kid, even though for the last 20 some years I've been more or less a Byzantine Catholic, for precisely those reasons, that Byzantine parishes tend to be smaller and the liturgy is still beautiful. And it's not contaminated generally by left-right politics like you see. It's just normal people, bunch of people who are different, come together to worship God, which is nice when you're in a minority. But where it just so I think people are attracted to something that's real, which is what attracts them to the traditional Latin Mass. But then politics gets involved, and Mike knows I'm hypercritical of tradies because it can get so militant And and it doesn't, and so unfortunate. It's unfortunate because I understand the attraction for beauty, and just like the people who are LARPing with the pipes and stuff, I understand it.
I totally understand.
I live on a farm for precisely
Yeah,
those
yeah,
reasons,
yeah.
because I wanted my children to be connected to something that's real, and I wanted myself to be connected to something that's real, and and that's, I think, also the attraction for me of distributism is to how do you get out of that, the corporate wage earner distance from nature and God mentality, which is the heart and soul, ironically, of liberalism, right? Is to be alienated from both of those things, and to become just an avatar or a commodity of yourself, right? You become a brand.
I guess my shorter answer is you can't, right, under the current system, unless you're independently wealthy, right? And then you can sort of do it for yourself and create a bubble. But most people, it can't happen without a change in the larger system, as much as we would like. And I'm beginning to doubt that we can do that from the bottom up. I mean, I am also attracted to localism. I think it's grand when people cooperate. It's just so hard. But I was going to say something more about you had mentioned, yes, a beautiful mass is better than a sort of Walmart style mass. Totally. It reminded me of something that happened to me. I think it was about a month ago. Our student church is under construction right now. And I'm a member of the basically the campus Catholic Church. And so I went over there for an evening mass because I was thinking, well, this way I can try to not get COVID. So it was a 9:10 mass. It was on a weekday, right? So I think it was Thursday evening. And we were in this cafeteria with rows and rows of chairs. So it's not beautiful, but they can't help that, right? They're building a very nice church, I suppose. But so I'm sitting there, and pretty soon at 9:10, every seat is taken. There must have been about 250, 300 chairs in this cafeteria. So it's packed now. Okay. And went through the mass, it's a pretty normal mass. But at the end, they prayed the St. Michael prayer and something else totally in Latin. They sang a song totally in Latin. And all the kids, I mean, 95% of the people there were college students.
Wow.
Amazing. And they were all like singing in Latin. Everybody knew it. Obviously, they'd been there a lot. And I, of course, didn't know those, right? So I'm just like, wow. And this is an interesting experience. I was really kind of rattled by it, right? But it said to me again, like they're obviously, when young college kids get out on a Thursday night en masse at 9:00 to like do this, and then have given the effort to memorize a Latin song and prayer, they want something. And that needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed seriously by the church as well as by the rest of our.
Absolutely. Because I think, with the that phenomenon, when I'm quite often describing to people, like, so I run a parish, I'm a layman, I run the parish and the campus ministry. But I'm always, when somebody from the parish might say, gosh, the young kids are, kind of showing some of this interest in Latin. Before I can even begin to maybe articulate where I might disagree with the young people, my whole body wants to say, but can't you understand it? Can't you understand it? Can't you understand it? When they've been uprooted from everything and their world seems to be governed by unelected, bureaucrats. Michael and I are always talking about this shift that everything we agree with right now used to be seen as liberal. Now it's being seen as like arch conservative, but like being run by big pharma, intelligence agencies that are unelected, where you have like James Clapper as a hero on CNN. Like these are very confusing times. So this reaction, I think we need to say how understandable it is. And I also think it's probably less of a threat than, the huge land grabs by a Bill Gates and so forth. I don't know, sane people could disagree. But right now, because it is cosplay too, we're laughing at the cosplay. But it draws more attention. And I think the attention, because these young people are dressing up, is probably disproportionate to some of the evils that I really think they're fighting, right? So I know in our local parish too, I have fun with it, but in English, a former priest started the St. Michael prayer at the end of Mass. And so there's a whole body of people that say, I will just not pray it. And then I tell them that, like, I don't know, Leo the 13th, right? You praise him for this, but apparently he was an ignoramus when he instituted this other thing, the St. Michael prayer, just to try and keep the two factions working together, that within the person of Leo the 13th, you had Rerum Novarum, and you also had the St. Michael prayer. And Mike Martin and I, if you've heard some of these podcasts, Laurie, that this notion of the dragon, the left brain, the algorithmic, reptilian nested loops type of a technocracy that's descending, that some type of prayer against that is an image, as opposed, which both the left and the right kind of conspire towards. I kind of like the imagery of that prayer, And so I think these young people, in as much as we're teasing them a little bit now, boy, we need to listen to them. And again, I think more than left, right, the invitation is always towards, we need an understanding of what constitutes mature thinking. And mature thinking does not mean a move to the left, because this other stuff is for the birds too,
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, it's that, like what you saw at that cafeteria, there's something that we need to listen to profoundly, as opposed to just saying it's a phenomenon of the right and let's do away with it, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't even think for the kids it's a phenomenon of the right. I don't think they're.
No, I don't think they're thinking of that. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so the church has an opportunity that I think it's missing to tap into this to reintroduce some of these teachings. Not because distributism, for instance, is necessarily like exactly what they ought to do or try to do to live this out more fully, but because those teachings would get them thinking and would give them something even stronger to hold on to, right?
Yeah,
so that would be a bridge, they're seeking something. They're seeking something bigger and more authoritative than their individual choices. This is a scary world, and they're being told, "Oh, go out and like recreate yourself. Do everything, create the wheel all over again for yourself. And by the way, the system has changed to the point where you're going to be in debt for like half your life, at
100%,
least,
right.
pretty much your whole life." And but like you're on your own, and that's that's just not human. And so they're seeking something, and I would like, if I had my way, the church would address that at an even deeper level and start drawing them into, for instance, support workers movements, support, anything. I mean, most of these measures are halfway, but anything that helps people both make a living, but also have like a life. Life is not to work, but that's what we've turned things into. Everybody works. And, a lot of people for very little, and even people who make a lot of money, it absorbs most of their lives. There's not a home life. There's not a community life, because we're all devoted to work. So anything that the church could do to kind of say, okay, you want something more, let's talk about, like not only what's wrong with the way, society is right now, but like led by something like the church, you could actually start to make some changes. You could start to create some community. That's, in my like fantasy.
No, I like that, but my thought, and actually another one of our friends and guests, Therese Schroeder-Schieker, we talk about this often on the phone, that I think, and I see this in my college students, a sense of betrayal by all of the institutions around us. Including the church. That there's this overwhelming sense of betrayal, and that in a way that, and I call them, to borrow language from Gnosticism, the archons, all the power brokers are, as you mentioned in one of your podcasts, and is one of the founding in Rerum Novarum, is that the powers are stacked against the little guy. And as we saw in the early days of the pandemic, when this great migration of money from the poorest to the wealthiest, And even where I live, so many small businesses went out of business. So many. And
I read a stat last week that said
upsetting.
40% of restaurants or something or small businesses couldn't pay rent
Yep.
last month. They're waiting for the holidays, but couldn't do it.
It was dreadful,
Mhm.
and it was predicted too. It was not only was it so, and if it was predicted, it was probably avoidable. But I think it was by design, which is why. So what's left with us is left to us and to these young people that we teach is trying to. I mean, this is the classic thing. How do we then live? How do we find a way to live an authentic human life? And I think in terms of distributism, at least as we understand it, I think probably the biggest problem is it's been ghettoized as just a Catholic thing for a very small minority of Catholics. But though I think this is something that has a much wider appeal, and even outside of religious contexts. At this time in history, anyway, maybe 100 years ago, it was more of a Christian thing, and I think its underlying principles are certainly Christian, but
Right.
but I think that there's a wider appeal where I'm wondering is it time for a secular reiteration, or do we just need rebranding in this distributist project?
Well, I don't know, but I know it can't be done through just a few people who tend to be, traditional Catholics. Obviously, that's not distributism. When you read Chesterton, for instance, he was calling for the government to make changes that would allow for more property ownership. So you can't just say, oh, I like Benedict option style, I'm just going to go to a town, I mean, that's like the best you can possibly hope for. I'm going to go to a town where there's more people like myself and
Mhm.
we'll do it together, or I'll try to do it in my own, my own neighborhood or something like that. Chesterton was saying, no, the government created this problem by favoring industries that were larger
Right.
and you see that all the time, here in my own town. The local government decided that big box stores were, for some reason, probably better for their tax haul in the long run, maybe, I don't know, but better than local businesses. And so they used eminent domain to basically roust out a lot of local businesses. And now we have Bed Bath and Beyond and, Best Buy and all of that. Right.
Yeah.
And they did that.
Mhm.
They decided that. And I think that that's partly what people need to know is that distributism is not this sort of like individual decision. I'll just live this way and talk this way. It is brought about, just like land reform in other countries, it's brought about by government, and usually that involves some sort of, if not a revolution, some sort of very strong upswelling of just discontent that forces a government to change its way of proceeding in support of more distribution or redistribution of property.
Right.
Um,
And
I think you'd really like this book, Laurie, this Preparata, because he wrote it with a bunch of friends at the Vatican. It's called New Directions in Catholic Social and Political Thought. And it's the only thing I read. And that's why I reached out to him, as I read his work. And then we became friends. And I traveled over to Italy in the fall to meet with him and some Italian anarchists to talk about perishable currency, because we had talked about local currencies. One people who were there, they're the founders of Sardex, which was a local currency after 2008 on the island of Sardinia that's still just thriving throughout Italy. Now it's got some downsides and it's not perishable. That being said, this book, New Directions, was truly, for me, who's been reading into this stuff for 20 years, the only thing new, and there's a great chapter in there on, again, the neoconservative takeover of the church, right? And it's written by a guy who's now this is paradoxical, like Opus Dei. His name is Jeff Langan. He used to be at Notre Dame, and a guy, like, you never know where it's going to come from, but they've assembled some of the people who kind of get it. But the, where we're going to go, when you read the book I have over here, I photocopied it years ago, is Belloc Smaller book, The Redistribution of Property, right? And at least the idea that they saw that you could have a smaller government, but also pretty powerful on this idea of, I think there's a movement in Vermont of Vermont secessionism where, because it's a small state, the right says, yeah, we don't want our National Guard guys fighting in these and dying over in Afghanistan. And the left says we don't want more than one McDonald's total in Burlington. But you could have the redistribution of property. Belloc shows that it could be a small government that with just simple laws would say, your first McDonald's, it's not going to be taxed too high. Your second within this geographical region is going to be taxed really high. And a third one is just completely inconceivable. And for all my reading of Distributism, What's Wrong with the World, I've read it many times. That's about the only thing that kind of stays with me. Like that might be doable, but like that the imagination could think of a government to favor the right that's smaller, but also just in crucial areas has really strong coercive powers, right?
Sure. Yeah, it would have to. Yeah, if you don't have something like that under the current conditions where the cultural factors are kind of blown up, you would just get the reemergence of the same problem we had. It probably
100%.
20 years and everything would be back to the way it is now, right?
Right.
Because it's so in lieu of actual cultural cohesion, the only thing you've got is a strong government, which in and of itself is a tragedy, right?
Tragedy.
But it is also probably, at least in the short run, or maybe even medium run, like an irreversible tragedy. So, and then the question would be, can you have that form of government without it becoming its own a menace? Which to me means you have to have some liberal elements within that government, even though liberalism has, I think caused our going down the liberal path has caused a great deal of destruction. But one liberal element is proceduralism, right? Just like building into place checks, a certain amount of checks and popular checks on any sort of government that you have. Because otherwise, if you give that kind of power to a government, you've got even bigger problems than we have now, So the modern tendency is totalitarianism and tyranny. And that,
to
put it simply, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Canada. Yeah. So interesting. I mean, you mentioned, we're talking about redistribution of property. Well, it's already happening. It's going from the small to the big, right? Like
right.
That's nothing but just the new form of enclosure. Eminent domain, so you can put up a big box store, but also I see around here is these little subdivisions of McMansions will go up, right? Which will raise the taxes. So this is John Taylor Gatto, I think, was the first one who brought this to my attention. So the taxes go up, and then in these rural communities like where I live, then if the taxes go up around these McMansion neighborhoods, then it spreads out. Then the farmers, like us, their taxes go up. Then eventually they can no longer afford to keep their land because the taxes are ridiculous, and they have to sell, which was by design how it was happening in the first place. So you get gentrification, and what happens is real estate agents start to populate the local boards, and then it's game over for a livable life.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah, we have our own McMansion subdivisions out west here, and when I drive through them, which I don't even know why I did the last. I've been out there. Can't remember why. It's just I look at that and I'm like, where are these people coming from? Because, I make a decent living as a university professor, but I in no way could afford, one of these. They've got to be like $500,000 to $1 million like homes. And there's a lot of them.
And they're ugly. Yeah.
They're ugly. There's no trees. It's characterless. And this is dinky Manhattan, Kansas. And I sincerely, don't know where they're coming from. But
that's a great phrase. I sincerely don't know where they're coming from. I feel the same way. I honestly don't know where they're coming from.
I don't know. Yeah. Where is the money coming from? Is it
I feel the same way.
California or, but there's such a gap. There's such a gap between that way of life, and even my way of life, let alone the way of life of people in our town, like so many towns, you go rich, middle class, poor geographically, right?
Mhm.
Like there's an end of town that's pretty poor. Then you got the middle, which is middle class, and out there on the west side where the hills are, you've got the wealthy. And that's the strangest thing is, I think even when I was a kid, the difference between a middle class person and a wealthy person culturally was not that great. They could still be in the same Rotary Club together or whatever. Now it's really huge,
Mhm.
right? And then you're in total different planets between the wealthy side of town and the poor side of town.
Yeah.
And they have contempt for each other, I think. So there's so little overlap. It's difficult to even, I mean, this is a huge part of the problem too, is we can't even talk to each other. We're in different worlds economically.
One thing I saw that, like, I'm always looking, so if the worst is the corruption of the best, I read an article, say 20 years ago, and it was called Worms in the Leviathan, which obviously brings up Thomas Hobbes, right? And we think we're living in something of a Leviathan, but it pointed out how when we mention McMansions, we can think of gated communities where a big tract of land is brought. So let's think of Sun City, Arizona. I've had two uncles who live out there. Somebody buys a big tract of land over an aquifer, and they don't need to do this, and they don't need to do this, and they have some autonomy. But, when we think of that being done for gated communities, a lot of us want to kind of throw up a little bit in our mouth and so forth. But the same thing, if we're really struggling to say, where could we try new experiments, is that same possibility of buying a large tract of land. I think of the monastery, 2,700 acres over there. It can be used for some experiments, right? That could be, they're seen as a worm in the Leviathan, that you could set up your own school system. Now, you and I think we all feel, I can't judge you, Laurie, but like when these things start, they can easily become tyrannical, right? And I do love my experience working in a monastery for so long, because there's a lot of wisdom in how local communities form. But Mike and I, we also did a podcast one time on, the parallel polis. That, are we living in a society right now where we have to start, building new polises within the current polis? And I know I'm still kind of like, that's the song I'm singing, that like things have come to such a pass. We've talked about young people and how this hopelessness that they feel, this anonymity in the face of like these faceless institutions that have so much power. There is a sense of urgency. And I think we have to start trying these things that some people might find, quixotic, that some of these small little enterprises, because one of them might take off, and again, like smaller scale political entities. I think the key word subsidiarity, it's another jargon word, right? But to study Dorothy Day and is to know that it's real, that I just don't see the church ever giving us teeth in that to say, no, the smaller entity is the better one by far. And we have to keep on teaching people that the smaller entity where people face to face, you're less likely to treat them like objects. We have to, and the American Solidarity Party, pretty good. I wish they were called the American Subsidiarity Party. I think we'd actually get farther, because I think of those two, jargon-esque Catholic words, subsidiarity is even more important to me, should probably be the lead dog in the sled over the word solidarity, which can kind of mean everything and nothing.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's definitely the route to a more interesting life.
Sure.
To, like, have direct contact with other people and to begin to rely on them. It's really hard. So I kind of wish my podcast partner was here. Spencer he's
I'll have to look him up.
he's been in, we might like to interview you guys, and you can be in
Fine.
that way, if you would think about
Sure.
it.
Sure.
But Spencer has been trying to do something like this at a fairly small scale in Kansas City. He's been there for about Kansas City, Missouri for about, I want to say 5 years now, maybe 4. He has some land, which he farms. He started out trying to form a small community among friends, and he just couldn't get anybody to buy into it, even though they did share some values in common, particularly an interest in, if nothing, I mean, I guess I would say localism, or, cooperation and communal living, and interest in organic farming, small farming. But when it came right down to it, it was too scary for any of them. He can tell this story better, but one stuck around for a while, but he too left for a conventional job because the risk, I mean, I'm interpreting, 'cause I don't know what goes on. The risk was too great. The idea that they might be making a mistake, that, you know, what's going to happen to me when which is a legitimate worry, like when I have an illness, when I am old, you know, like, am I going to actually be able to count on this? Is this going to grow? And of course, you've got, they would have a lot of other people kind of talking to them, like their parents and their friends, saying, what are you doing? You know, like, that's crazy. You're giving away like your financial security. Of course, we know like financial security is what does that even mean? You know, when you
Pretty
have
ephemeral nowadays, right? Yeah.
right. So it's always been really like,
Yeah.
it's one, you know, so it's one disease or one stock market crash away, but like, so he literally couldn't get anybody to do that. So then he turned to like market gardening to try to at least do, you know, the organic farming, and with the idea that maybe, you know, showing that you could supply people at the local level with food. And he lives in this is a fairly poor area. This is the east side of Kansas City, Missouri. So it's kind of racially mixed. There's a lot of Hispanic people. There's like just a lot of poverty, and places are kind of run down. And so in that, you know, he tried to cooperate, or I should say we, because I'm in the mix as well as some other people at that point, but try to cooperate with Catholic Worker House there. Didn't get a whole lot of traction because they weren't interested in taking the food, because they were so addicted to
The food trucks, right?
yeah,
I mean, not the
like,
food trucks, but like the food banks, right?
the food that's donated from grocery stores.
Yeah.
It's easier for them to produce, right? So they really didn't want that. He could in no way make enough money to support himself with the people. There was a little bit, you know, who would buy his produce. There was a little.
We found that our local Catholic Worker House only wanted eggs. Like if we had organic eggs, they really wanted those.
Which
but
is, wow.
This one didn't trust eggs either.
Okay.
Because, you know, when chickens poop them out, I don't know where else they come from, but when chickens poop them out, there might be some poop on them.
Poop them out.
But so, you know, like he experienced a little upswing during the pandemic because of supply chain issues, and it was kind of hopeful. We thought, well, maybe people will learn from this, that it's really it's just kind of stupid to like hope that you can get all your food from some far-flung place, maybe, you know, but it didn't last. And so at this point, he has turned to homesteading and is going to turn we've sort of renamed that farm the John Paul II Catholic Worker Farm, but it's basically a homestead where we hope to show what you can do when you're just trying to like feed yourself through your own labor to the extent that you can.
Right.
But so I guess what I'm trying to say is like, I've lived through, you know, this example. I've watched Spencer struggle, and I know he's not alone. It's so hard to get other people to cooperate with you, whether it's partners in some sort of like cooperative setting, who are too afraid, whether it's like consumers who sort of say they get it, but won't actually put their dollars consistently where their mouths are, to even institutions like the church or a charitable institution or even a Catholic Worker House that don't really get the value of cooperating at a deeper level. It's really hard. Okay, so I'll shut up, but like that.
No, but
I
think you're right. I mean, even the Catholic worker is contaminated by corporatism, right? Yeah. Which is, you know, the food bank thing. Which the irony, you know, I told you that I used to be the gardener for a first generation Catholic worker, and there was a Catholic worker farm, maybe 40 miles away from here, back in the 40s and 50s. And our friend Larry Chapp has a Catholic worker farm where's he in Pennsylvania? He's in
Western Pennsylvania. Yep.
Pennsylvania. But the other thing that gives me hope, though, as I mentioned earlier, so now I became a full-time farmer 5 years ago, 2017. So I was at a small Catholic liberal arts college, which suddenly tanked. We in August, we July we got our contracts. August 1st, we got a letter saying the college will close at the end of the fall semester. Yeah, that's how they roll. And so what am I going to do? I didn't want to move. Too old. I'm not going to apply for a job someplace in a different state. So we had this farm. So we thought, let's throw that together. Let's try to do that. And it's a lot of work and it's not a lot of money. But it's very satisfying. But where I'm going with this is, so 30 years ago, when I first found out about the CSA movement, there was one CSA in the state of Michigan and maybe 10 in the entire country. Nobody knew what it was. But now, even from where I sit, I think within a 15, 20-mile radius, I know of at least 5 CSAs. So it's certainly, and even though I sometimes have to still explain what CSA stands for, more and more people know about it, and more people are interested. And I think like you said earlier, it's gonna take a paradigm shift.
Or the next big crisis, right? I mean,
well, it's going to take a crisis or the collapse of governments and corporations, which I pray for daily.
Well, imagine the government, instead of spending billions to support big ag, took even a fraction of that amount of money to support national security interest of local agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, and they don't. They go. In fact, that's what we mentioned. Bill Gates gobbling up all the farmland. And the thing is, even with big ag or some of the even bigger family farms around, they would not exist were it not for being subsidized. Because farming is basically a break-even enterprise. We make money, not a lot, but we make it because we're small scale. We don't use any power tools. So we don't have as much overhead as a lot of those places. So there's a higher profit margin, not huge, but but you can see it's called sustainable agriculture for a reason, because it's not just sustainable to a degree. And if we had more space, which we're thinking about selling our cows and going back to goats, so we have a bigger garden. It's sustainable not only financially, but it's sustainable environmentally, and it's sustainable psychologically too, because it restores sanity. But like you said, and as your friend Spencer, is that his name? There's the risk is real, right? The risk is real that, and we did see that the first year of COVID and the pandemic, we did see an explosion in interest in joining the CSA, which trailed off the next year, but not considerably. But it's not an easy gig, and market forces are against us.
Yeah, I think having selling meat is probably makes it a lot more likely that you can make a living. I think that you just make more money doing it, and I would agree with you on everything else you said, that it can be like self-sustaining in the sense that you don't need a lot of inputs for that type of farming. That's what makes it so great. But like if a person has enough land where they have cattle, goats, you can do chickens, then you probably have more of a chance of making enough money to be able to make a profit than if you're just vegetable gardening,
right,
which is what he's trying to do. But that might be an argument for getting more land. I mean, it's good to hear that you're able to do it.
I mean, no, I still have to do other things to make money, but so do most farmers I know. Even the guy I buy hay from he's got a couple hundred acres. He works as an accountant, so that's just how it is. That's the reality as it is. But I think in a way, we're my dog's barking in the way. We're moving toward the future in this. You're kind of planting these seeds, not for now, but for the future, to show that it's possible. And then hopefully we'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm. That's
Keep
great.
the fire burning. Yep.
Right. I just really would love, to see even a minor shift in our funding situation, because food in this country is so highly subsidized. People aren't paying anything like what it actually would cost to produce
Exactly.
it, right? The
Mhm.
government's they support the big farms, and they support the consumer. It is the most socialized part of our economy.
Mhm.
And that's what the local farmer is up against, who can't plug into that.
Right.
They can't plug into the subsidization. They can't compete with the very low, unrealistically low prices of things in grocery stores. And that's due to the government intervention. And so, to get back to distributists, they would definitely call for that, right? Like a reorientation of both government funding and breaking up these big agricultural, like Tyson, like
Right.
practical monopolies.
Well, and now the U.S. government, I don't know if you're aware of this, they want to have a census of gardens, of people's gardens,
What?
including ours, right? Oh yeah, because I'm sure they're coming to get us next. I'm sure of it.
What the
Yeah,
heck is that really? What is that about?
we got a letter 2 years ago at the beginning of the Biden administration where it was a voluntary thing. How many animals do you have? What and how much do you grow? Like, none of your business. And it was voluntary, so we ignored it. And they're on their way toward mandatory. And not only for people like us with I think our garden's an acre and pasture, but even people with smaller gardens.
My goodness.
And for
I think it's like, and they came to take a census. We're heading towards the
Oh,
Christmas
yeah.
season. Maybe when they finally take a census of every little animal, we'll have the second coming of Christ, right?
That's right.
Ugh.
That's my
in
old
the middle of
Hebrew
the census, in the middle of the census of everybody's chickens.
My old Hebrew teacher, rabbi, he said, "Mike, let me tell you something. When they start counting Jews, it's bad news." And it's it's the same thing with anything, it's potentially bad news, and we looked at that as the handwriting on the wall,
Well, sure.
But anyway,
you can outlaw whatever you're doing in the name of health and safety, right?
Sure.
Like,
health and
Yeah.
safety.
we've seen
That's right.
so much of that, and so that could just
Security.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yep.
That's right. And the Obama administration, actually, they were trying to. I don't know if they were outlawing, but they were after compost.
Really?
They were after compost because they were afraid it was contaminating food.
I just think of how people have just lost the taste of whole milk, or that people are weirded out
raw
by
milk,
brown eggs, right? Now, I've just got some chickens, but people see that, rich orange yolk, and it actually makes people freak out now,
Yeah.
right?
Like, what's wrong with it? What's
Yeah.
wrong with this,
Slowly but surely, we've grown that the real kind of makes us feel viscerally, ill at ease.
That's right.
Quite often. Yeah.
Can you wrap it in
Yeah.
plastic first?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's a wonderful, probably a good place to stop. And Laurie, this has been such a pleasure for both
Really
of
has,
us.
Laurie. Yeah.
Same here. It's really great to meet you guys, and love your podcast. And, I hope that Spencer and I can have you on ours.
That would be wonderful. We'd
Do
love
so,
that.
and count on me to start listening to those. The name of your podcast, Laurie, and how else can people get in touch with the book you mentioned and things like
It's
that?
called Dust Bowl Diatribes,
Okay.
and so that's on all the platforms.
Mhm.
And then Peter Morin, if people just Google the Morin Academy,
Okay.
they'll get the website that hosts that podcast. And my book is called Ideological Possession and the Rise of the New Right. It was published by Routledge in 2019.
And no, you have a new book coming out from Whip and Stock.
Whip and Stock book. Yeah, I'm behind by about a year because I had a couple of deaths in the family. It was really
Sorry to hear that. Yeah.
but I'm kind of back on it. I've got a sabbatical this spring, and it was tentatively titled The Gap in God's Country because it's going to focus on the Midwest and politics in the Midwest and the rural-urban divide, but more through a religious lens than any of my other books have done.
It's
So,
like, What's the Matter with Kansas with kind of a religious gloss.
yeah, with
Yeah.
a fairly serious religious gloss, plus
Yeah.
a lot of like fairly heavy Marxist economics, without actually like saying that. Maybe, I don't know. Like, I think I'm not trying to hide anything, but when you
Yeah.
say Marxism, people get scared, but like literally we do need to understand the dynamics of our economy. So I'm going to be injecting some of that.
Good,
Okay.
good.
Well, thank you so much. And we
Yeah.
appreciate
Thank you for
this.
coming on the Regeneration Podcast, and we look forward to talking and seeing everyone again next week.